Like Esteban said, I'm going to talk about the careers of two camp doctors that took two completely different courses. One took a major role in the mass murder of inmates, and the other one refused to take part in the atrocities being committed in the concentration camp system. We already heard what happened or what didn't happen to inmates, doctors that refused to take these orders. So what happened to an SS doctor? The myth that one would be deported into a concentration camp or even be killed immediately if one would have refused to follow a criminal order still stubbornly remains in Austria and Germany. It's always a discussion, well, what could one do? I mean, orders were orders, and if I hadn't done this, I would have been shot or something. But in his study, Ordinary Man, Christopher Browning already showed that this was absolutely not the case. When being asked if the members of the Police Battalion 101 wanted to be relieved of their delicate mission, which was the killing of Jewish civilians in Eastern Europe, of 500, only around 10 stepped forward. And nothing, absolutely nothing happened to these men. They were just assigned to a different task. So refusing was possible. You just needed to have the courage to do so, which of course didn't just have anybody. Some cases, though, show that there were men that couldn't manage to violate their own moral principles, and I want to present one of these cases today, as well as the opposite. Eduard Krebsbach was born in 1894 in Bonn, which is located in the western part of Germany on the Rhine. He was the oldest son of a, I quote, respected Catholic family of merchants from Cologne. After school, he started to study medicine at the University of Freiburg in Breisgau. That was until the beginning of World War I, when Krebsbach volunteered. He volunteered for the infantry, where he worked as a member of the field ambulance. After World War I, he continued his studies, wrote his doctoral thesis, and graduated in 1919. And 1 year later, he got married and opened his own doctor's office near Cologne. From 1925 on, Krebsbach worked as district medical officer in 4 German districts. But after the coming into power of the National Socialist regime in 1933, he was dismissed from his post because he was regarded as politically unreliable. Kurt Kaul, who was a high-ranking SS officer, stated in 1938 that Krebsbach's attitude was, I quote, undoubtedly anti-Nazi in the years before 1933. But after 1933, this changed. Immediately after his dismissal, he joined both the National Socialist Party and the SS. And well, this of course helped him in finding a new employment. And soon he was appointed panel physician for the police in Freiburg. In 1938, he finally saw a chance to prove his loyalty to the Nazi regime. In the course of the November pogroms, he led a troop of SS men that burned down the synagogue of Freiburg, a deed of which he was really proud of, because in front of a police officer he claimed he had acted by direct order of Joseph Goebbels, which was of course just bragging. But anyway, the doubts about his political attitudes were gone, and Krebsbach remained police physician of Freiburg until the beginning of the Second World War. After the attack on Poland, he joined on the 1st of October 1939 the Waffen-SS, and as a member of the Death Heads unit, he participated in the military campaign against France. After that, he became police physician again, but this time in the occupied Elsass. In May 1941, he was drafted again to the Waffen-SS and got a training from the medical department of the SS in concentration camp Sachsenhausen. In June 1941, he took the office of chief post physician in the Mauthausen concentration camp. Here, he met Ladislaus Conrad, a young camp physician, who was one of his subordinates. This is a family picture of Conrad. He's on the left, the very young looking man. Yes, he was 20 years younger than Krebsbach. He was born in 1913 in Siegendorf in the east of Austria, where his father was working as a clerk in the sugar factory. Conrad graduated 1934 in Vienna and registered for medicine at the University of Vienna. Although the National Socialist Party and its organizations were prohibited in Austria in June 1933, Conrad had joined the SA already in October 1933, being still in school. 1 year later, he joined the National Socialist Party. And his political views at that time can be seen on official documents from the University of Vienna, because as early as 1935, he stated in his enrollment form in the field Volkszugehörigkeit, nationality, that his was Deutsch-Arisch, German Aryan, which was actually quite uncommon at that time in Austria, even for Nazi students. He seemed to have been quite active in the illegal Nazi movement, since he was also a member of the banned Nazi Student Association, whose members took part in all kinds of propagandistic and violent activities against political enemies. And the documents of the Vienna University archives also show that Conrad took many courses under anatomist Professor Eduard, who was also an illegal party member and who went on to be dean and rector under the Nazi regime later. And some of you might know him because he's probably best known for his controversial anatomical atlas, for which he used the bodies of that concentration camp inmates and people condemned to death. All this information clearly indicates that Conrad was already a man of rather strong ideological beliefs, even before the Anschluss, the so-called annexion of Austria to the German Reich. Immediately after the Anschluss in March 1938, Conrad joined the SA again. He left the SA when joining the Nazi Student Association. And 2 months later, he changed over to the SS. In March 1940, he received his doctor's degree at the University of Vienna. And then he moved to Wiener Neustadt, which is south of Vienna, where he started to work as company physician for the Wiener Neustädter Aircraft Company, where German Messerschmitt planes were manufactured. In contrast to Krebsbach, the Nazi district administration stated in April 1941 that Conrad had already been in favor of the National Socialist ideology during the time of the illegalization of the party, and that he was, I quote, politically, in character, and professional immaculate. The local group leader in Vienna also considered Conrad, I quote, an upright National Socialist who is ready for action. Shortly afterwards, unfortunately we don't know the exact time, Conrad was either assigned or volunteered, again we don't know that, to Mauthausen concentration camp as camp physician. The 28th of July marks the first entry of his signature in the book of operations from Mauthausen concentration camp. I don't know if you can see it here. This is his signature. So he operated quite a lot. The first entry says he opened a cyst behind the right ear of a Spanish prisoner, Antonio Garcia, who was to die in 1944 in Mauthausen. The last entry from Conrad in the Book of Operations is from the 10th of December 1941. So in 1941, you had these two characters working as physicians in Mauthausen concentration camp. You have Krebsbach, the veteran of World War I, who had supposedly been opposed to the Nazis until they came into power, but quickly developed an attitude of ingratiation towards the new regime and who was eager to prove his loyalty. And then you have Conrad, the young doctor who recently graduated and who had been a committed follower of the Nazi movement, convinced that their ideology was the right one. Now, what was their agenda? What was their daily business in Mauthausen? As chief post physician, Eduard Krebsbach was in charge of the entire medical staff in the main camp and all the sub-camps. He performed selections in the camp where he decided which prisoners were to be killed. And he was also present at executions to record the deaths. He was even present while prisoners were being gassed, and he apparently kind of elaborated the system of gassing in Mauthausen after ordering a gas car from Berlin, which he did not receive in the end because of complications regarding the production. He supervised the construction of the gas chamber in Mauthausen. Ladislaus Conrad was, as camp physician, one of numerous, of course. One of his colleagues at that time actually was Aribert Heim, from which we're going to hear later on. Conrad was responsible for the medical care of the prisoners and for preventing the spread of infectious diseases in the camp. Here you can see a picture of prisoners waiting for disinfection in Mauthausen. But actually, to achieve this goal, it was common practice to kill sick prisoners, which was done mostly by lethal injections at that time. In autumn 1941, after the arrival of the first Soviet prisoners of war, the mass murder of sick prisoners by heart injections began under the supervision of Eduard Krebsbach, and former prisoner František Poprawka, who worked in the sick bay, later recalled, "The injecting began with Dr. Krebsbach. Therefore, he was called Spritzbach. Spritze is an injection in German. There was a syringe with a very large needle. The syringe was filled with petrol or phenol, and the needle was injected directly into the prisoner's heart. At first, it was done without anesthesia. Later, the prisoner was anesthetized in the operating room." Here you see a syringe used for injection in Mauthausen. We have it in our exhibition. Especially during the typhus epidemic between July and September 1941, the killing of sick inmates by injections were performed really excessively. Nearly everyone who was infected was killed by the SS. Ladislaus Conrad was first assigned as camp physician of Gusen, a branch camp of Mauthausen, where he was confronted with the killing of sick inmates for the first time. According to Ernst Martin, who was a prisoner and worked as clerk for Krebsbach, Conrad asked after only 3 days in Gusen to be relieved. He said he was a doctor and wouldn't do such things, a thing that was, well, quite unique amongst the SS physicians. After that, he was transferred to the main camp, where obviously things were different. Here he was also supposed to give lethal heart injections to sick prisoners. And not only Ernst Martin later recalled that Conrad strictly refused to do this, but also Nikolaus Hovorka, who worked as prisoner medic in the sick bay. Hovorka wrote, "He refused to apply lethal injections to inmates with the repeated and clear justification that he had sworn an oath at his graduation to heal the sick, not to kill them alive." According to Ernst Martin, Krebsbach and Conrad had recurring violent arguments on this topic, and finally Conrad quit and asked to be transferred to the front. Martin reported that although he was a prisoner, Conrad, before leaving, visited him in his quarters and, of course, in the absence of other SS men, bid him farewell and wished him all the best, which Martin returned. So what happened later on? There's not so much to tell about Ladislaus Conrad after his transfer. He ended up on the Eastern Front, where he was part of staff of an SS armored infantryman regiment. And, well, he got awarded with the Iron Cross in December 1942, that we know. And in 1943, he got engaged to an Austrian girl called Walpurga Brauner, whose father was a Nazi district leader, but the marriage finally didn't come about because on the 17th of February 1944, Conrad eventually was killed in action in the course of the encirclement battle near Cherkasy in the Ukraine. Krebsbach, meanwhile, also was transferred in October 1943 after he had shot a soldier of the Wehrmacht who was on leave in the course of an argument. This was quite a scandal in the region because the Wehrmacht soldier was from Mauthausen, and he was on leave, was a bit drunk, and was singing in front of the house of Krebsbach, and Krebsbach just went out and shot him. Krebsbach was officially cleared of all charges by an SS military court, although he had shot the soldier in the back. It was obviously that he had to be moved far away after this incident because he couldn't be seen there again. So that's why he was transferred to concentration camp Riga Kaiserwald in Latvia, where he was again chief post physician and again took part in mass killings of prisoners. In October 1944, he was dismissed from the Waffen-SS because of his age, for which reason then he worked as company physician in 2 German companies. In May 1945, he was arrested by members of the US Army and was tried in the Dachau-Mauthausen main case. There he preferred not to defend himself because the burden of proof was overwhelming anyway. He was found guilty in all points and was hanged on the 28th of May 1947 in Landsberg military prison. Well, the rare case of Ladislaus Conrad shows, contrary to the common arguments of SS members, it was possible to refuse illegal orders without any consequences other than a transfer. It's clearly interesting that, albeit his obvious strong political views, Conrad still was a man of conscience who preferred going to the front rather than to violate his own ethical principles. So the question is, why was he such an exception? Why weren't there more men refusing to accept illegal orders? The transfer to the front resulted in the death of Ladislaus Conrad, but he could also have survived. One simply had to choose between this, let's say, safe haven of the so-called home front and the dangerous real front. And that's exactly the point. Most perpetrators chose the easy way, and even if they knew they were committing crimes and were not convinced that they were doing the right thing, as many others were, they rather chose to obey than to refuse. The pressure that lasted on these men was a social one, not a professional. If they refused, they had to cope with being called cowards, weaklings, or even traitors, which of course took courage, but let's face it, what's that compared to having a clear conscience? This case and a few others also known today show one thing above all: the myth that it wasn't possible to say no just doesn't hold up. Thank you.